All right, hello, everybody. This is the first in a series of videos that we're going to be doing about some of the lore, the armored lore, if you will, of Armored Core. This game is a lot different from a Souls game, right? From the way that it controls all the way up to the way that they are telling this story. It's not the same, so it's not really going to be like, the lore diving that people do with a game like Elden Ring, but there's still some really interesting stuff happening in this story. So the first video that we are going to be doing on this is just kind of laying out who the major players are, who the main characters and organizations and forces at play in conflict with each other are, that are sort of going on in the background of this story when you arrive on the scene in mission number 1. So we're going to start off with probably the most important character in the game that is not you, which is Handler Walter. Walter is a handler for independent mercenaries. And the word handler, the way that it's being used here, it's kind of like in a national security context or in an intelligence agency context. A handler is a person who is giving information to an agent who's in the field, giving them directions, giving them assistance. So a handler is not a person who's like, in a foreign country spying. A handler would be the person who the spy calls at night and tells them, hey, here's all the intelligence that I gathered today. So that fits in very well with Walter's character in this game. He is giving us information, giving us missions. We work for him, and we are kind of the boots on the ground. He knows Carla, who's another character who we are going to talk about in a second here. They have some sort of pre-established relationship, so it seems like this is not his first rodeo when it comes to Rubicon and the Coral. Definitely seems like even early on in the game, you're getting some hints that he has a background on this planet and he knows people here. And that drives a lot of the story, trying to figure out, well, who exactly is this guy and what is his history? He's got some very mysterious motives. The only thing we really know when the game starts is that he brought us here to get our life back. He says that we're a mercenary, our brain got fried by something, probably whatever process puts our consciousness into the Armored Core. So we're here to make some money and work for Walter. There is also an AI that we have access to early on called Allmind that exists for mercenaries. It can run simulations for us, and we see this with the arena. The arena is a simulated environment, kind of like the holodeck in Star Trek a little bit. You're not actually fighting other ACs, you're fighting simulated reconstructions of them in a digital environment. Allmind is also what sends you on the log hunt, which is this activity in the game where you can defeat certain enemies, specific enemies, to get unique parts and things like that from them. So that's Walter. That is Allmind. Moving on to the two major corporations that are operating on planet and their subsidiaries. The first one we have is Balaam Industries. They have a subsidiary called Dafeng, and a subsidiary is just a company that's owned by another company. This is really, really common in the world. Pretty much any company that you can think of is probably technically owned by another company whose whole business is owning and running companies, and then the companies below them do other things like producing products and stuff like that. Dafeng produces these heavy parts, like if you're going for a tank build in the game, you're probably going to be running a lot of Dafeng parts on your build. But they also have an armed security branch, which is something that you see with most of the corporations in this game. And for Balaam, their armed security branch is called the Red Guns. They are led by a guy named Michigan, and it seems like they are kind of scrappy. They seem to have high turnover. It's kind of implied when you start to work for them that you are filling a position that recently opened up, and that whether people are quitting or blowing up on the job, that's a real workplace hazard when you're on Rubicon. There's some inexperienced pilots that work for them, and in general with Balaam, what you see is they're sort of less advanced. They're using older tech. They are kind of the underdog, at least when it comes to comparing them to this other corporation that is operating on planet, which is Archibus. And Archibus is actually, it's a very, very old firearm. It was one of the first European firearms. It saw use in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. So we're talking, the early 1600s, there were firearms on the battlefield, and also spears and swords and people on horseback. But an arquebus was basically like a hand cannon, and you would load it and aim it, and you would get one shot, but if it hit somebody, it would take out like just a grapefruit-sized chunk of their body. It was quite the weapon to see on the battlefield. So arquebus, maybe kind of harkening back to the very foundations of mechanized warfare. I don't know what time period this game takes place in, but, the 30 Years' War, those types of European continental conflicts are 400 years old to us now. But you still see people kind of referencing that history in this game, which is interesting. They also have a subsidiary called Schneider. Schneider focuses on creating lighter builds, so like those reverse joint legs that you see that can enable you to jump really high and be really fast. That's what they specialize in creating. They, just like Balaam, have an armed security force as well that's called the Vespers. And Vespers is actually a term that was used in monasteries. This is another kind of historical callback with this corporation. Vespers was the evening service that monks would observe. There were I'm trying to think back to when I read The Rule of Saint Benedict in high school. There were probably 8 or 9 services that these monks would do, starting with one at the break of day, or even before sunrise. There was a service, then there was a sunrise service. Throughout the day, right, they are taking communion, they are doing these sacraments, they're singing, they're reading passages of the Bible. Vespers was the evening service. So I don't know what that's supposed to tell us about this armed security group, but I just thought it was an interesting reference. In general, Archibus is kind of the top dog in this game, at least when it comes to the corporate forces that are on the planet vying for control of this coral substance. They have 2 great characters that we have all come to know and love, or at least love to hate, V2 Snail and V4 Rusty. So yeah, these guys are, like I said, kind of the top dogs, very fast and light, elite fighters, advanced tech, and they're a little bit arrogant too in some of these communications that they bring to you. It's kind of like they know that they're, at the top of the pile. So moving on from that, we have another force that is not a corporation. It's called Reuse and Development, or RAD, or just RAD. This is run by Cinder Carla, who is a person who knows Walter, and their relationship is elaborated on further in the game, but I don't want to spoil it because it is an important part of the story. But RAD, their whole thing is recycling this old technology that's on planet, and just kind of selling it to the highest bidder. Whoever is going to pay them enough money for it. They have conflict with different corporations and with the PCA. They have kind of turbulent relationships with these people called dosers, which we don't really get to learn a whole lot about who they are, but apparently one of the uses of this substance called coral is that it's intoxicating. It's like a drug. So people use it like a drug. They use potentially violent means to get their hands on more of it and maybe develop an addiction to it. So they kind of have a turbulent relationship with these people. Sometimes they are employing dosers, sometimes they are fighting them. But Carla also created an artificial intelligence named Chatty. It says in the in the little description that we get of him, that she wanted somebody to just like talk to her and bounce ideas off of her, but she accidentally created an AI that only ever said exactly what it needed to and nothing more. So maybe didn't really quite take care of the isolation that Carla was feeling. All right, next up we have the Rubicon Liberation Front. This is certain different promotional materials have described them as an indigenous fighting force on Rubicon. That word indigenous is an interesting one to choose here because it kind of implies that these people are from Rubicon. They were born there. They can trace their roots back to this place. They didn't come from somewhere else. I'm guessing, obviously, at some point they landed here. I don't think that humans as a species are indigenous to this planet. But that word brings to mind all sorts of different political connotations, because at the end of the day, the RLF is a religious insurgency that is being led by a charismatic religious leader, a guy named Father Dolmayan. Dolmayan or Dolmayan, that's actually an Armenian last name. The drummer for System of a Down is John Dolmayan. I don't know if he likes this game, but I thought that was kind of interesting because System of a Down rocks. They're awesome. But they're underfunded, they're outgunned, they are the total underdogs in this story. Their goals are self-determination and autonomy. Basically what any kind of indigenous religious insurgency would want if they had beef with outside colonizing forces. We want to get these people who are extracting our resources out of here. We want to have control over our own resources. We want to have autonomy. We want to be able to govern ourselves. There's a lot more to say about the RLF, but that's probably going to be the subject of a different video, because I think, on the whole, this game actually handles that topic pretty well. All right, next up, the Rubicon Research Institute. Look at the quality of this photo. Look at this. We're professionals here. I could not, for the life of me, find a higher quality picture of that. So that's just what we're going to have to deal with. The Rubicon Research Institute is a scientific research and development corporation that existed before the what they call in the game the Fires of Ibis. So when they had this big coral collapse, when they thought that all of the coral had burned up and that there was no more of it. That was about 50 years ago, probably in the timeline of the game. So 50 years before we get there, these people were using coral for weapons and technology development. And there seems to have been some conflict within the Institute about whether or not it was ethical to be using this substance in this way. And I'm trying to be careful with my wording here because I don't want to spoil anything. But even at the beginning of the game, we learned that, at least in part, the armored core that we are operating is using coral in some way. Right before we crash land on the planet, we hear that Walter is activating something called the Coral Control Device. So in some way, Rubicon Research Institute contributed to the way that we are able to pilot all of these mechs now. It's kind of fuzzy. There's some spoilery stuff that I don't want to get into, but they were the first people to really comprehend the coral's potential. They were the first people to start experimenting with it, and they left behind some of these autonomous machines that may or may not be like operating on coral-based artificial intelligence. So there's two bosses in the game. Both of them were shown in promotional trailers, so I think it's okay to talk about them here. One of them you fight at the end of Chapter 2, and then one of them you fight at the end of Chapter 3, and both are great fights. But the Rubicon Research Institute really comes into play more in the latter half of the game, where you start kind of coming to understand what it was that they were doing with this research and technology. And then lastly, we have the PCA, which is a government body that is interested in keeping the planet closed to outsiders. So they have set up this perimeter with like these orbital laser cannons and all sorts of different types of technology to use these overwhelming resources and force to cordon off Rubicon 3, to make sure that people don't come down and mess around on the planet. They're not doing a great job because there's tons and tons of people there ever since the coral reappeared, who are there to try and extract this resource and profit off of it. But your beef with the PCA definitely grows over the course of the game. They are waging war on pretty much everybody who's on planet, so that includes the corporations, the RLF, independents who are there. Basically, anybody who is landing or migrating to Rubicon 3 illegally. And that's actually, I mean, it's like the very first thing you do in this game is illegally cross a border and obtain forged documents so that you can extract resources from a war zone. And if that's not cool, I don't know what is. So those are some of the major players here, and what is going on and people's relationships to each other. The next video, hopefully, that I'm going to come out with is going to be diving more into this question of what exactly is the coral, what does it do, what does it mean, how important is it to the story. That one's going to have tons of spoilers in it, so if you have not at least finished one playthrough of the game, maybe try and do that before we dive into that. All right, thanks.